This is just going to be a short video about F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. It looks like the US has approved that Denmark and the Netherlands can transfer these aircraft to Ukraine. That is good news, but I think many people are confused about the big picture and the big purpose of providing fighter aircraft to Ukraine. So let's talk about it. The discussion about fighter aircraft to Ukraine has been going on for a long time. It started last summer, but it's still going on. But I've said from the beginning that it was just a matter of time, that this will happen eventually. And the reason why I felt so confident about that was that since Russia's full-scale invasion, the Ukrainian armed forces have been in a transition to NATO standard equipment. So, for example, they started with Russian standards for artillery ammunition, 152 millimeters, but now they have almost entirely changed to NATO standard equipment that use 155 millimeter ammunition. So this transition to Western equipment and Western standards has taken place all over the Ukrainian armed forces. And it makes sense because it's obviously that Ukraine will get their supplies from the West in the future. They can't order more ammunition or spare parts in Russia. So obviously this transition also has to take place in the Air Force. If the Ukrainian Air Force does not transition to Western aircraft, then eventually they will not have any aircraft left, because they can't get spare parts for their old Russian planes. And also they can't grow with a fleet of Russian aircraft. So that's why I've been so confident that eventually Ukraine will get fighter aircraft from NATO, because there's no other way to keep the Ukrainian Air Force flying. And this is where I think a lot of the discussion about F-16s is misguided, and where I also think that short-term political considerations maybe can get in the way of making the necessary long-term decisions. Because I think too often this discussion about fighter aircraft is being coupled with discussions about the current tactical situation on the front lines. So right now, Denmark and the Netherlands are leading a program to train Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16. And it has seemed clear all the time that these countries also intend to donate some aircraft after the training is over. And now that transfer of F-16s to Ukraine has apparently been approved by the United States, so that can take place. But the more important thing to understand here is that building a new Air Force is a huge thing. It's a long-term investment. There have been many discussions about whether it is a good idea to give fighter aircraft to Ukraine and if it would make a difference in the current counteroffensive and these things. But I think to some extent, this misses the point. I think Ukraine would be able to use F-16s for some tasks very quickly. For example, it's pretty simple to shoot down incoming cruise missiles that are heading for Ukrainian cities. So if Ukraine gets F-16, then they can very quickly use them to improve the air defense of the country. It's much more difficult to use fighter aircraft, for example, for close air support on the front line. This will require a much stronger force and much more training and integration. So there are different tasks, and some of them require more than others. So yes, I do think that if Denmark and the Netherlands provide, let's say, a few handfuls of F-16s, then that will make a real difference right away. It will help defend Ukrainian cities against cruise missiles. But it will not immediately give Ukraine air superiority on the front line. That would require more. And that's where I think it's important to keep the long perspective in mind. If for a moment we put the war aside and we look at what kind of air force would it actually make sense for Ukraine to have in peacetime, then I think for a country the size of Ukraine and with the location they have, it would make sense for them to have a pretty big air force, maybe 200 or 300 aircraft. That would not be unusual for a country like Ukraine. And my point with this is that I think this discussion about fighter aircraft, in this discussion, there's too much focus on here and now, whether it is the right tool for Ukraine's current counteroffensive. And obviously, the answer to that question is no. What Ukraine needs for this battle this summer is artillery ammunition, because that is something that can create battlefield effects right now. But when we talk about the Air Force, then we need a longer perspective. And the discussion we should have is what kind of Air Force we want Ukraine to have in 4 or 5 years. What kind of Air Force do we think Ukraine should have after the war has ended? And then we should start building that Air Force now so that it can grow over time. So what would that plan look like? It looks like by the end of 2023, Ukraine will have 0 Western fighter aircraft. It's too late by now to make it before New Year's, so it's going to be 0. But then perhaps at the end of 2024, they can have, say, 30 airframes, and by the end of 2025, maybe they can have 70. And by the end of 2026, that can be, let's say, 150 airframes, and by the end of 2027, Ukraine can have maybe 250 Western fighter aircraft. And most of these can be F-16s, but some of them could be some other type. It's this kind of visionary, long-term perspective that needs to be the basis of a discussion about the West providing fighter aircraft to Ukraine. And the smart thing about this is that such a goal makes sense regardless whether the war ends or not, because it builds up to a reasonable peacetime strength of the Ukrainian Air Force. So in the beginning, the F-16s can be used for simple things like improving the air defense of Ukrainian cities. But over time, the Air Force will grow in strength, and it will be possible to gradually achieve air superiority. And if the war then stops before that, then that is great. But we will still build up the Ukrainian Air Force according to the same plan. So what I'm saying here is that it is good that Denmark and the Netherlands are now allowed to donate F-16s to Ukraine. But if we really want to rebuild the Ukrainian Air Force, we will need much bigger numbers than what these countries can provide. Ukraine needs hundreds of fighter jets, not just for the war, but also for the peace afterwards. Okay, that was just my quick comment about fighter aircraft for Ukraine. If you found this video interesting, please give it a like, and also remember to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to get notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.